The King in Yellow at the Mountains of Madness, and of course, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. These are all some of my personal favourite weird fiction stories, which are written to invoke a sense of cosmic horror in the reader. And that they do very effectively with their themes of forbidden knowledge, unknowable entities beyond our comprehension, and perhaps most importantly, the utter shattering of the indomitable human spirit. But these are all well-renowned and well-known pieces of literature which have kind of become classics of our time, so I'm here today to convince you that actually one of the best horror sci-fi settings ever written is from the tabletop game Warhammer 40,000. But in this video, I'm not going to be telling you the stories you've heard before about the tyranids and the space marines. In fact, we won't be mentioning the Imperium of Mankind at all, because today's story takes place in a lesser explored part of Warhammer 40k's history, long ago at the beginning of time and the creation of the galaxy itself, where gods are hurled into existence, dark entities consume stars, and the lowest of life forms cry into the void, and the void cries back. So today I'm going to share with you the entire origin story of the 40k universe and prove to you why this dark, forgotten piece of history is one of my favourite examples of cosmic horror ever written. Spooky whoosh. Spooky. So I consider myself to be a connoisseur of sorts for horror, sci-fi, and the whole kind of weird fiction Lovecraftian genre in general. I've been consuming it since I was about 14 years old, and I've even managed in my time to read Lovecraft's entire repertoire of stories. Yes, including those ones. So TLDR, this whole kind of like cosmic horror thing is my jam, and I love it very much. But I also love Warhammer, so as you can imagine, I would love to make more videos on all of the cosmic horror and Lovecraftian influences that I see in 40k lore every single day, such as the long-forgotten AI, the tyranids, the warp, other mysteries, and generally the pockets of lore concerning the futile torture of mankind and other sentient creatures in the far future, and even the abominable transhumanistic horror that is the Space Marines themselves. Try and say that 3 times fast. And I promise you that if this video goes well and if you guys show enough interest in it, then I will definitely make more like it. So make sure you pop a comment in the comment section, either to say that you like this video or give me some suggestions of topics that you'd like me to cover, because I definitely have the itch for making some more spooky Warhammer 40k content. But without further ado, I invite you to settle in, grab yourself a comfy drink, and join me as we travel back in time to the very beginning of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. At the beginning of it all, there was light, and whether by design or by chance, the universe exploded into existence. Young stars screamed and pushed their newfound energy against the black until they shone like beacons in the void, and in the void, the first beings saw that light and felt the first urge, which of course was hunger. One of the first entities in this fledgling universe were the star gods, who would later become known as the Catan. These beings were impossibly huge masses of half-materium consciousness who drifted through the fresh blackness of the galaxy, intent on consuming the life force and energy from its stars like loathsome dark parasites. But although they predated all life in the known universe, after a while it became clear that these famished young star eaters were in fact not alone. A new race, in fact the first race of real, conscious, living, organic beings had began their life in this universe as well, and they would become known as the Old Ones. The Old Ones were a scaly, cold-blooded, reptilian-like race of beings, and they weren't much to look at on the surface. They weren't pretty or spectacular in appearance, but these life forms possessed something which would, for the rest of time, prove to be the most valuable thing a being being could possess in this universe, and that was powerful psychic abilities. The Old Ones had the innate ability to psychically connect with the infant Immaterium, which then was a lot more swirling and malleable than the hellscape with its pantheon of gods and demons, which we know of as the Warp in the 41st millennium. This meant that they quickly mastered the art of interstellar travel over vast distances, using their primitive but effective warp portals, and in their mastery over millions of years, they rapidly expanded and developed across the galaxy. In their expansion, they would eventually come across the star gods themselves, and in doing so, they discovered beings who, seemingly in defiance of the Old Ones' love for life expansion and growth, would primitively suck the life from one system to another, doing nothing but consuming in a vain attempt to feed their insatiable hunger, and thus the star gods and the Old Ones' hatred for one another was cemented for all of time. The Old Ones expanded their empires and their minds, creating new intelligent living races to populate their planets from their own genes, such as the brutal yet intelligent Krorks, primitive ape-like creatures which they nurtured upon a very familiar planet, and of course their most beloved creation of all, the beautiful, artistic, and psychically attuned Eldar. But whilst all of these beings would change with time and become the war-broken races which we recognize from the 41st millennium, they are not the focus of today's very, very old tale. For as the universe was still in its primitive state, we find this story's doomed and unfortunate protagonists, the Necrontyr. The Necrontyr were a race of unassuming and somewhat lanky mortal beings who, unlike the Eldar, were not blessed with the privilege of being created by the Old Ones. They developed alone and on their own in the galaxy, and whilst lacking a benevolent creator does not in of itself doom a race to a meaningless existence, the planet which held the Necrontyr hostage during the civilization's formative years certainly would. For the Necrontyr's great folly wasn't pride or rage, but that their planet of origin orbited too close to a hideous and fettered star. This dread star riddled the race's weak organic bodies with wretched and unpreventable cancers, dooming each individual over millennia to an existence of pain and suffering, which perhaps mercifully or perhaps to add further despair, led also to them having an extremely shortened lifespan. The Necrontyr endured their suffering for millions of years, trying everything in their power to counter or even hide from their sun's terrible presence, but alas, they found themselves trapped on their planet, unable to alter their fate, despite generations immemorial of trial, error, and pain. Eventually, the Necrontyr developed rudimentary interstellar travel, far removed from the efficiency of that used by the Old Ones or their Eldar, but finally, they were able to escape their planet and their cursed star, and they expanded to other planets with less hostile environments. But to their dismay, they were unable to escape their fate. They realized quickly that what had started as an attack on their bodies via their circumstances had slowly mutated into an unescapable hereditary disease, and the painful, life-shortening cancers which plagued their whole race remained within their bodies no matter how well they hid or how far they ran. To make matters worse, the Necrontyr in their expansion finally came across the Old Ones, a prosperous, intelligent, and thriving race full of life, hope, and creation, and they saw in the Old Ones everything they had been stripped of merely for committing the mistake of dragging themselves into existence on a doomed planet, and for that, they hated them. The Necrontyr, in their desperate fury, declared war against the Old Ones, a war so huge, bloody, and utterly brutal in its nature that it's said to be unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, and this war was fittingly named the War in Heaven. Even when the Necrontyr brought the full force of their armada against the Old Ones, whilst it reunited their somewhat fractured civilization under a mutual banner of hatred, it was, unfortunately, another futile endeavor. Unable to outmaneuver the Old Ones or the Eldar due to their mastery of the Immaterium and their own physical advances, the Necrontyr lost. In fact, so utterly pathetic was their defeat that after the battle was lost and the Necrontyr, having suffered unspeakable losses, were banished to the dark corner of the universe, now known as the Halo Star region, they were considered by the Old Ones to be nothing more than merely a petty nuisance, like too many ants trying to form an anthill, and they could be easily thwarted once again if they ever dared to raise their heads once more. This was truly a shameful defeat for the already punished race, and they remained in their dark region of space for thousands of years, slowly turning their jealousy into a deep, all-encompassing hatred for the Old Ones, which was passed down and which only grew from generation to generation. In all of their anguish and suffering and shame, the Necrontyr, however, did manage to do something that no other race before them had ever managed to do, or at least none that lived to tell the tale, because the Necrontyr managed to reach out into the void and make contact with the star gods themselves. Now, this part of the story is a little bit lost to time. We are very, very unsure of how exactly the Necrontyr managed to actually do this. But in my opinion, I think it's safe to assume that during the Necrontyr's thousands, if not millions of years on their home planet being ravaged by their own cursed star, and in an attempt to try and counter their star's horrific adverse effects on their people, they developed certain technologies to help them obsessively study these celestial bodies. Perhaps they developed devices that help them listen, communicate, translate, or even in a desperate attempt to call out to the stars to plead with them for mercy, and perhaps it's reasonable to assume that the Catan, those formless sentient star eaters lurking in the darkness of space, may have called back. The star god known as Mephet-Ran reached down from the heavens to communicate to one of the Necrontyr lords known as the Silent King, but these star gods in their immensity, power, and presence did not possess physical forms of their own, so in order to communicate with the Necrontyr, they would have to be given physical forms, which the Necrontyr happily provided for them, and they built the star god a body made using their living metal technology. And for a while, encased in their new powerful bodies, these Star Eaters were revered as gods amongst the Necrontyr. Seemingly pleased with the reverence he had received from these lowly humanoids, the embodied Star God offered the Necrontyr a gift. They would be given new powerful bodies, which would not only be free of their cursed star's diseases, but in fact would never die, granting them what they had always wanted: power, and more so, immortality. And of course, this offer would be given freely and with absolutely no strings attached, and with nothing asked in return from the poor defeated race. A gift, perhaps, as a display of gratitude for granting the star god a physical form. The Silent King, desperate, defeated, and seeing no other future for his people, eagerly agreed, and in doing so, he unknowingly doomed his entire civilization for all of eternity. The Necrontyr marched into impossibly huge and strangely manufactured biofurnaces, where the body transference from organic matter to cold, hard metal began, and the Necrontyr realized that they had made a terrible and irreversible mistake. The star god, who would later become known as the Deceiver, had fooled the Necrontyr into giving away what made them mortal beings, stripping them of their life force and spirit, and leaving them trapped within new cold metal bodies, conscious but lacking that vital life essence or soul that they once possessed. The previous punished yet resilient race of humanoids known as the Necrontyr were gone, and they were now replaced by the soulless automata who, for the rest of time, would be known as the Necrons. And worst of all, to the Necrons' horror, they found that the star gods, in their cruel trickery, had found a way to feast and gorge themselves endlessly upon the life force that they had stripped of their race, just as they had the energy of the stars. And yet, in the horrific ruin of the civilization's organic bodies and mortal minds rose exactly what the Necrons were promised: the capability to finally form an army army, millions strong, of all but immortal warriors, with the power of star gods and all of their immaterium-bending technologies now at their disposal, which would give them the advantage they sorely lacked in their first almighty clash against the Old Ones. And so the Second War in Heaven began, as brutal and as bloody as the first, but this time thanks to the cruel gift of the Deceiver and with the aid of the Catan themselves, the odds tipped in favor of the Necrons, and the Old Ones were finally defeated. With the war in heaven against the Old Ones won, the Necrons, in their desperation, were left with one more enemy to pursue. In order to feel fully avenged, the Silent King knew that the impossible must once again be done, and he must once and for all defeat those who stripped away their very souls and made them the cold husks that they had become. The Star Eaters themselves, the Catan, must be destroyed. The Silent King waited patiently, anticipating a time when the Catan may show a mere mite of vulnerability, and when that time came, he enacted his grand betrayal. In secret and unbeknownst to the Star Gods, the Necrons' highly intelligent cryptech engineers had been channeling their almighty knowledge into creating powerful cannons, capable of dispelling unimaginable energy and destruction on a god-killing level. And it's said that so destructive and so utterly immense was this final attack against the Star Gods themselves that it may have fractured the nature of time and space itself. The Catan were dismembered, but not fully destroyed, as how can one truly destroy a god made from the very stuff of reality? They were, however, shattered into thousands and thousands of pieces, or shards, with each shard containing but a fraction of the unknowable god's original power. However, with the Necrons knowing just how immensely powerful each of these shards would be, they were not merely cast into the void of space to become forgotten for all of time. To aid in their uncertain future, it was decided that each of the shards would be contained within its own tesseract labyrinth, which is a dimensional pocket of space of sorts, so that under the watchful eye of their new soulless overlords, the Catan shards could be unleashed upon enemies to serve the Necrons' purpose, or dragged screaming back into their cosmic containment cells, sometimes for centuries at a time, should they begin to show any sign of disloyalty or failure to comply. But with their mortal enemies shattered and now enslaved to their whims, the poor broken Necrontyr turned Necrons knew that they still had not won, and trapped within their cold dark bodies, their minds void of happiness or even the ability to feel, and with new and more psychically adept races such as the Eldar, who had fought alongside their creators, the Old Ones, during the War in Heaven, starting to expand and thrive across the galaxy, perhaps they knew that they never would, at least not for a very, very, very long time. So the Silent King did the unthinkable, and after destroying all of the plans and blueprints for their god-shattering weaponry, he ordered the Necron worlds to be converted into great, dark, planet-spanning tombs, and finally ushered his entire race to enter an advanced slumber which was to last them 60 million years, known as the Great Sleep. And so the Necrons slept, awaiting a time when their race could awaken at full force to destroy and finally pick at the corpses of whatever civilizations were left fighting for life in the grimdark universe of the far, far future. And that is the end of today's story, but in reality, or at least the fictional reality of the Warhammer 40k universe, it's really just the beginning. What I just told you was basically a summary of events written spookily by me, but it's also quite a heavy simplification of the history of the doomed Necrontyr, the Old Ones, the War in Heaven, and all of the other things which happened at the creation of the 40k universe. And I missed out a bunch of cool stuff for the sake of making things easier to digest in a timeline for people who maybe have not heard this story before. If you're interested in finding out more about this particular chapter in Warhammer history, I really recommend that you do your own deep dive. So you can discover more about mysteries such as the Catan Shard of the Void Dragon, which lives beneath Mars, or, as I conveniently forgot to mention, what became of the Silent King, the only Necron not to join his civilization in their 60 million year-long sleep. Like I said before, the Warhammer 40k universe is so unbelievably huge and expansive that it's essentially impossible to maneuver yourself around it without stumbling upon some fantastically well-written and well-developed weird fiction or science fiction horror. So please, if you did like this video, then leave a like and let me know in the comments section, and also let me know what weird little pocket of 40k lore you would like me to spookily summarize next time, because this was great fun. Anyways, I'm afraid that is all we have time for today. As usual, thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and as always, thank you for being rogues. I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye. Bye bye.